This didn't start with an explosion. There was no breaking news alert, no emergency speech, no moment that clearly signaled the world had just crossed a line it could never uncross. And that's exactly what makes it so dangerous. Because right now, as you go about your normal routine, there are shifts happening beneath the surface of global power that most people will never see until it's too late to react. For decades, Americans were told that the system was stable, that threats would be detected early, contained quickly, and neutralized before they could ever reach a point of no return. That belief created a sense of invisible security, a quiet assumption that no matter how chaotic the world looked on the outside, there were structures in place strong enough to hold it together. But what if that assumption is no longer true? What if the systems designed to protect global stability are no longer capable of keeping up with the speed of modern conflict? Imagine waking up tomorrow to a reality where a single overnight shift, one strategic move executed quietly and efficiently, instantly changes the balance of power across entire regions, not gradually, not over years, but in a moment so sudden that no government has time to prepare a response. This is not a distant possibility. This is the scenario that defense planners, intelligence analysts, and policymakers quietly fear the most, because once it happens, there is no reset button, no easy solution, and no guarantee that anyone is still in control. For decades, the global system functioned on a fragile but powerful promise that a small group of dominant nations, led by the United States, could maintain order by controlling escalation before it spiraled out of control. This was never about eliminating conflict, it was about managing it. Through military superiority, intelligence networks, financial dominance, and strategic alliances, Washington built a framework that ensured no sudden, destabilizing threat could emerge without being detected and stopped early. That framework created something more valuable than peace. It created predictability. Allies trusted it. Markets relied on it. Ordinary people lived under it without ever thinking twice. But over time, that system began to shift. Power was no longer just measured in weapons. It was exercised through sanctions, economic pressure, and access to global systems. Countries that challenged the order, including Iran and North Korea, were pushed further into isolation, cut off from trade, finance, and technological exchange. On the surface, this looked like control, but beneath that pressure, something else was forming. Isolation did not eliminate their ambitions. It forced them to adapt, to collaborate in ways that were harder to track and even harder to stop. And this is where the real fracture begins. Because the more the system relied on pressure instead of balance, the more it created blind spots, gaps where cooperation between sanctioned states could grow unnoticed. What once felt like a controlled environment slowly became something far more unstable, where the very tools used to enforce order started accelerating its breakdown. Now consider the scenario that quietly sits at the center of this growing instability, the one Western planners rarely describe in public, but constantly model behind closed doors, a large-scale, covert transfer of advanced missile systems not moved in a single dramatic operation, but broken into smaller, almost invisible phases, routed through regions where surveillance is limited and political boundaries complicate intervention. No single shipment triggers alarm. No single signal looks catastrophic on its own, but over time, the pieces accumulate. And by the moment analysts connect the dots, the operation is already complete. The systems are no longer in transit. They are deployed, dispersed, and protected. At that point, the conversation changes instantly. It is no longer about prevention. It becomes a question of response. And every possible response carries consequences that extend far beyond the original threat. What makes this scenario fundamentally different is not just scale, it is the technology itself. Modern missile systems eliminate the vulnerabilities that older defense strategies depended on. There is no long fueling window to detect, no fixed launch site to target, no predictable trajectory to intercept with certainty. Solid fuel propulsion allows launches within minutes. Mobile platforms make tracking unreliable at best. Independent guidance systems reduce the effectiveness of electronic interference, and maneuverable reentry vehicles transform interception into a statistical gamble rather than a reliable defense. This is not a gradual evolution of military capability. It is a shift that breaks the assumptions underlying existing defense architecture. And once that shift occurs, the strategic dilemma becomes unavoidable. Any attempt to strike these systems risks triggering a conflict large enough to destabilize entire regions. Choosing not to act allows the new balance of power to solidify, weakening deterrence everywhere. Covert disruption operates too slowly to address an immediate threat. Defensive systems, no matter how advanced, face the reality of being outnumbered and outpaced. Even diplomacy demands an admission that the strategic landscape has already changed. This is the trap one where every path forward leads to a different form of crisis, and none of them offer a clean resolution. At this point, the conversation can no longer remain abstract, because behind every shift in strategy, behind every change in deterrence, there are real human consequences that unfold quietly but relentlessly. When global stability becomes uncertain, it doesn't stay confined to military briefings or intelligence reports. It moves into everyday life. It shows up in rising costs, in volatile markets, in decisions made under pressure rather than clarity. It affects how governments allocate resources, how businesses plan for the future, and how ordinary people begin to feel a growing sense of instability they can't fully explain. A world where power balances can shift overnight is a world where long-term certainty disappears. And when certainty disappears, fear fills the gap. Not always loud, not always visible, but present in the background of every major decision. This is the human side of geopolitical change. And it is often the part most overlooked, because while strategies can be adjusted and alliances can be reshaped, the psychological weight placed on entire populations is far harder to measure and far more difficult to reverse. And as this pressure builds, it begins to reshape how nations behave on a global scale. The signal sent by a scenario like this extends far beyond any single region. It tells every observing state that the system can be bypassed, that the established rules are no longer guaranteed to hold, and that the cost of challenging the order may no longer be as prohibitive as it once was. This realization spreads quickly, influencing calculations in major capitals and accelerating a shift that has been building for years, the transition from a controlled international system to a far more fragmented and competitive one. History has shown that these transition periods are the most dangerous, not because conflict is certain, but because uncertainty increases the risk of miscalculation, and miscalculation, once it begins, has a way of escalating faster than anyone anticipates. What we are witnessing is not a single event, but a broader transformation in how power is understood and exercised in the modern world. This is not just a story about weapons or strategy. It is a story about what happens when the systems people rely on to maintain order begin to lose their ability to function as intended. For decades, the belief that global stability could be managed created a sense of distance between everyday life and geopolitical risk. But that distance is shrinking. The truth is, the world is not becoming more predictable. It is becoming more sensitive to sudden change, where a single development can ripple outward and reshape entire systems in ways that cannot be easily contained. And that brings us to the most important question: what do you do in a world where no one has full control anymore? The answer is not simple, and it is not comfortable, but awareness is the first step. Understanding how these shifts happen, why they matter, and how they impact the future is no longer optional. It is necessary. If this perspective helped you see the situation more clearly, take a moment to save this video so you can revisit it as events continue to unfold. And subscribe to the channel for deeper analysis on the stories that shape the world behind the headlines. Because in times like these, staying informed is not about fear, it is about preparation. And while the world may be changing faster than ever, the ability to understand it remains one of the most powerful tools you have.